Over the years and decades, there has been a lot of misconceptions about Michael Jackson. And while we've been able to definitely make strides in correcting some of those misconceptions, there's still quite a bit of ways to go. One of the biggest misconceptions that remains out there about Michael is the questions and beliefs as far as what happened in terms of his skin changing colors. For those that don't know, Michael suffered from two different autoimmune diseases that had an impact on his skin: vitiligo and lupus. We'll be addressing the lupus in our follow-up video to this. But for now, we're going to take a closer look at the vitiligo because it had an impact on Michael, not just physically in terms of how his skin looked, but also mentally and emotionally as well. To understand how the vitiligo impacted Michael as a whole, we first have to understand exactly what vitiligo is. Now, as we just mentioned, vitiligo is an autoimmune condition in which the natural pigmentation of your skin is depleted over time. There are different types of vitiligo, and it affects people differently. It's one of those diseases that don't really have a rhyme or reason to it. According to a 2022 article from Dermatology Times, it's estimated that roughly 83% of vitiligo cases have some sort of genetic link, factor, or composition within it. Also, the article states that the average mean age of the people that do get vitiligo is between the ages of 20 to 30. So this matches Michael because Michael's grandmother also suffered from vitiligo. Now, it should be noted that while Michael received his diagnosis sometime around 1985, 1986, which would have put him at the ages of 27, 28, he was showing signs of the vitiligo long before that, even when he was like a teenager in the 1970s. Behind me is a picture of Michael and his brothers from the late 1970s on Getty Images. Now, if you search this on Getty Images right now, you will be able to find it. So that means this image has not been doctored or altered in any kind of way. Now, if you zoom in, you can see the vitiligo on Michael's fingertips, which means he was showing signs of it as early as him being a teenager. This is roughly 40 years ago at this point, meaning the general understanding of vitiligo as a whole and the medications and treatments and so on and so forth that are available to people who suffer from the disease now were not available to Michael back then. And it's an unfortunate reality, but during this time period, people with ailments like vitiligo that affected their physical appearance were made fun of by the media and the general public as a whole. There's a lot of different examples of this throughout the decades, but the societal expectations that were put on people, especially celebrities, to look and be a certain way or to look perfect was just really kind of crazy for that time period. Outside of people just flat out saying that Michael bleached his skin, one of the biggest misunderstandings or misconceptions rather when it comes to Michael Jackson is not fully understanding how his vitiligo progressed. So let's take a look back. In the beginning, as testified by Michael's long-term makeup artist Karen Faye, the strategy for combating how Michael's vitiligo looked in public was to cover any white patches that he had with dark makeup that matched his skin complexion. As time progressed, the vitiligo progressed, which means the patches got worse, making it harder and harder to cover up his entire body with makeup. On top of that, Michael was very sensitive when it came to specifically his skin, and the biggest example of that is how he handled having acne as a teenager. Some of the people who were close to Michael, such as his mother, Katherine Jackson, and his sister, LaToya Jackson, have even gone on record to speak about how Michael was affected by the onset of his acne in the 1970s. In fact, LaToya even said that Michael's entire personality changed because of it, saying that before the acne, he was a lot more outgoing, whereas after the acne, he wouldn't even look people in the eye. Fast forward a decade later, and Michael is still a young man, only in his mid-20s, and he's having to battle a skin condition that depletes his pigmentation, lupus, which also affects your skin and its appearance, and then on top of that, he's had his scalp burned because of the Pepsi incident, and in that area where his scalp was burned, he was never able to grow hair in that place again. That is a lot for somebody who is only 25, 26 years old, and you can only imagine how Michael was feeling having to deal with all of those things at the same time. And if suffering from acne was something that deeply impacted Michael as a teenager, then you can only imagine what the vitiligo did to him. The best account of that we probably have is Jermaine Jackson's 2011 book, You Are Not Alone, where he details an experience of Michael during the 2005 trial. Now, to give you a little bit of a backstory, this was the day known as quote-unquote pajama day, where Michael had to go to the hospital because of back problems right before a court appearance, and he was suffering, really struggling, and the judge basically told him that he still had to come to court or else his bail was going to be revoked. So this is the scene. Jermaine and Mrs. Jackson and Mr. Jackson, their parents, were in the hospital, and Michael was just pulling off some of his clothes and kind of having just an emotional moment over everything that he was going through. And it's here in this chapter, which you can see behind me, that Jermaine notes that Michael didn't even really tell them about the full extent of his vitiligo. So this was the first time that Jermaine was really seeing the patches all over his body as he took his clothes off. So that kind of tells you just how sensitive Michael was about it. That said, once Michael's vitiligo progressed to a certain point, it was sort of counterproductive to keep covering him up from head to toe in full body makeup, especially with him being the most famous photographed person on the planet that regularly made public appearances. So, as per Michael's dermatologist, Dr. Arnold Klein, a decision was made to begin the depigmenting process. And it's here where we're going to address another misconception. Now, some individuals acknowledge Michael having vitiligo, but they say things like, oh, he purposely bleached himself to be white because that's what he wanted to be, which is just very ignorant. Folks, that's not possible. Let me explain. It's biologically, medically, and scientifically impossible to go from Michael's natural skin color to one that is completely without pigment. And that is what makes vitiligo sufferers different from somebody who has just chosen to bleach their skin. Because if you look at people who have bleached their skin, yes, they are a few shades lighter than their natural complexion, but you can still very clearly see the pigmentation within their skin, because it's impossible for virtually all of your skin pigmentation to disappear completely unless you have an ailment like vitiligo that's taking away your pigment, your melanin. It literally would have been impossible for Michael to bleach his skin to that color. Now, to counter that, some people might say, oh, well, what about the bleaching creams that he supposedly took? Well, let's take a look at that. Those creams, Binaquin and hydroquinone, are actually only meant for people with vitiligo, and they help with the skin evening process. People that don't have vitiligo can't use them. It won't work. And those creams that are used to even out vitiligo patients' skin, they can only match the progression of the disease. They can't take you here when you're here. They can only work in conjunction with how your vitiligo is progressing. So what you saw with Michael ultimately was a very, very bad case of vitiligo. Now that we have that established, there's one more thing that needs to be said. Michael Jackson was a proud Black man. Something he told Oprah in 1993 on national television when he revealed having vitiligo for the first time. Unfortunately, even with pictures and all of this information out there, Michael having vitiligo is something that still gets questioned. So, for those that still have those questions, if you look behind me, this is a copy of Michael's autopsy report, and it shows where he did indeed have vitiligo. We'll be addressing Michael's battles with lupus in our next video. But for now, thanks for tuning in, and remember, facts don't lie, but people do.